Hey, everybody. This is a Broken Brain reach back. Reach back? Yes. Callback to a previous episode. This is when I was able to have TK, the host of For the Love of History podcast, come on to talk about mental health care in olden times before we had the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, the DSM, back before we really had that. And what kinds of things went into diagnosis and treatment in like Pilgrim times and a little bit after that for a while. So this is a very interesting episode. The reason I'm putting it back up is because next week on Wednesday, it will be dropping a new episode where TK comes back to the program and talks about Abraham Lincoln and his experiences with depression, or melancholy as it was called at the time. So enjoy this look back at the past, where we look back at the past. Anyway, here we are with our discussion of the history of diagnosis.
Super interesting. I never really researched much about, asylums or state hospitals. You always see the things in movie theaters, like Shutter Island and all these scary movies.
And this predates the like One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, that sort of loving love letter to the mental health industry that kind of Shutter Island again, also, although written more recently, once again, really, really glowing depiction of the mental health industry at the time.
Exactly. And there's another movie. I think it's called Asylum. And I was looking for this one documentary when I was doing some research.
Yeah.
And the title of the documentary is Asylum, but this stupid movie kept coming up and I just could not find that documentary to save my life. Okay, I guess I'll watch this movie and not do my research.
Some like horror movie or something.
Yeah, it was this horrible like horror movie, definitely like a B movie, not good. Great acting, fantastic. CGI was off the hook, loved it, everything about it.
We've changed course now. This is now our new episode
okay,
topic.
Come on back.
We're gonna no. I mean, I think we should go with that. Let's.
Oh, okay.
It's probably just as not quite as well researched, maybe, but although in 1918, it's hard to say. The manual that we're using comes from 1918. It's the year after that the new movie 1917 was filmed. Or it happened. Yes. It wasn't filmed in 1917.
Yeah.
It's not a found footage movie.
It took them like 200 years to get out the movie. It was a long time.
The editing, post takes forever.
That continuous shot.
That's why we're gonna film record today's podcast in a continuous shot, audio style.
Perfect.
So there we are. But yeah, 1918, and I was just thinking about what was going on, and I don't know why. This is you as the historian person will probably, I say historian person. Is it fair to say historian? That's what you do, right? You teach history?
You can call me a historian person, historian, a lover of history. Either way is fine. Anything, see all of the above is okay.
How did you get into doing history, by the way? That's your whole thrust of your podcast.
Yeah. So actually, history was kind of thrust upon me. My dad is a history buff, and anytime we went on a family vacation, he would always make us research the history event or some sort of, event that went on in that place. And all of our family trips were based around some museum or historical site, or usually battles. My dad is so huge into like military history because he was in the military. So I rejected it harshly at first as a teenager, and then I accepted it into my heart, as one does.
That's how that goes. We make we round the corner, we kind of round the corner of adulthood and say, oh, I guess it's all right.
Yeah, and I made it kind of in the States. I was a junior high school world history teacher. Mm-hmm. So.
And you live in Japan, is that right?
I do.
Yeah.
I live in Japan now. One day I just Googled how to live and teach and work in Japan, and I found this job.
Nice. Was there thoughts before Googling that, or it was just a random whim I mean, you must have thought of it literally before typing the words, I guess.
But. that was pretty much the depth of the thought. Like, I would like to live in Japan. Let's find out how to do it. So
there you are. Cool.
Exactly. Now I'm here 4 years later.
Yeah. Oh, nice. That's one of those. Well, that's like one of those inspirational things, right? You hear people say, like, make your dreams come true by Googling how to do them and then do it. Yeah.
Crazy. However you look at it.
Cool. So you probably already thought of this as soon as you saw this thing before, you probably even knew that it was in 1918, because I assume, being a history buff, you know everything. So this manual came out in 1918, which, with everything going on now, I should have realized is the Spanish flu year, right? I mean, aren't we talking a lot about that?
It's the Spanish flu year.
It didn't appear in this, not surprisingly, because I'm sure they compiled the materials before the actual release of the book.
Yeah, exactly.
I think that's how publishing works, or at least back then.
Yeah, something like that.
It wasn't a 24-hour news cycle back then. But the thing that occurred to me as I was reading it is so many of the diagnoses have to do with other, what would commonly be thought of at the time as physical maladies, I guess you could say it that way, although we'll get into that classification. And that didn't come up yet, was trauma from the Spanish flu.
Trauma from the Spanish flu and trauma from other wars also didn't really come up very much. There was a lot of things about, physical ailments, and a lot of things about moral decay. Like, before we had asylums and before people started to take notice of mental health in the first place, mental illness was thought to be, satanic possession, or, God was punishing you. So now here's some depression. So
you can go back even in like biblical stories that you read where people are kind of asking Jesus, even in the case of blindness, right? Is this a curse upon this man because he sinned? And then you had possession and things like that were thought of, any kind of odd behavior was thrown in to that, under that umbrella, right? Of like demonic possession, or just other you did a bad thing, so now a bad thing is you. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So in 1918, when this manual was being compiled, there was still that not a real separation between physical ailments and mental health. People didn't really know that there was a difference between the two of them.
And what I read into it is they're trying to be progressive and get away from some of the more superstitious thoughts and say, oh, you're not, possessed or evil or whatever. You have an ailment. And I almost feel like the way they had to approach it was by saying, like, well, you must have had cholera and now you're depressed because of cholera.
Yeah. Cholera, syphilis, any, you had a really bad cold, you got a chill or something like that. The mental illness came from the physical illness is what.
Yeah, that's what everything does seem to be in here. If we look at some of these titles, there's psychosis from cerebral arterial sclerosis. I slurred that just a little there. Senility psychosis due to drugs is in here, which is interesting because that has made it through. But if you look at that, other nervous diseases, different things like that, melancholia, of course, a term for depression we can get into too. Yeah. One of the really interesting things I thought was right up front, they talk about traumatic psychosis. And I thought, oh, trauma, that's a big thing we talk about now. However, not what we mean when we say trauma now in psychological health.
Same word, different meaning.
Yes. They're talking about you. The first thing I read is you get whacked on the head and then you not feel good so much after, I think is the exact wording.
Yes. Yeah. Whacked on the head, depression. There you go. Exactly that. And then I thought it was really interesting that they had psychosis with a brain tumor. For me, a brain tumor is definitely go to the hospital territory, not go to the asylum territory. You're not gonna, therapy your tumor away.
Yeah. And one of the really interesting things that I found about this was it was all well within the framework of research, of ongoing research is what it really seems to be. Very much different than now. Now they use the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Diagnosis, or the DSM, 5th edition. It's in a nice purple bound cover. It's gone through obviously 5 revisions. Well, actually more like it goes through revisions before it gets fully replaced. The DSM-4 TR, or text revision, was the one before that. And that's why you don't have to go very far back. I think it was in the DSM-3 that still classified homosexuality as a mental disorder. And then the 3 TR, I think, is where they dropped that. If I'm right, I don't know. Tweet at me, you super fans of the DSM. If any show has them, hopefully we do.
Don't blame me. I don't know.
She didn't say that. She didn't say that. But so it's been through a lot of different things. But one of the things that hit me is that now it reports on a lot of research that's been done. Whereas one of the things back then that they were building into this was they had suggestions on make sure that you're gathering all this data, because we don't know what the hell's going on. They didn't say that part. But, it was very much, there was a little bit more admission that we're gathering data still at this point, is what it felt like.
Yes, exactly. Like when they were talking about all of the different cards that they had to do, the inpatient cards, the outpatient cards, the repeat offender, that's not the word they used, but and
right. The readmission or whatever. Right. Yeah.
Yeah. Readmission. They were very specific. And when I was first reading it, I was thinking like, this is really not useful information. But then I stepped back and you were totally right. They're collecting data for the first time. So
one of the really interesting things I found, they have these suggestions for here's what you should be recording on this form or that form. They have the admission form, the readmission form. I went over it like twice just to see if I was right about this, but I think the only difference is in the readmission, it says, when were they here before? So it's like, okay, seems pretty straightforward. But
exactly.
But then again, to think of all of this as kind of groundbreaking stuff, at least in the U.S., at least at that time, right? To say that this was, and here's all these things they describe, saying you should really take all the cards that you get and all the data you get and separate by each criteria. And I was picturing people in a room somewhere physically, probably actually laying cards this way and then going over here and saying this and then that.
Yeah.
Because, it's easy now to look back and say, does it matter if the person was Armenian versus Slavic? I mean, there's a whole section defining racial terms.
There was.
But then you look at that and you're like, but what did they didn't know what was important, I guess, yet.
Exactly. Yeah. So just casting their net out as far as they possibly could, just to see if anything caught. Yeah, I think you're totally right. Was really important. When they were talking about the criteria for data collection, they talked a lot about the appropriate way to round up and round down the year numbers. You could not write they were, in there for 10 years. It was either they were there for 9 years or 11 years, not 10 years. We didn't have round numbers like that, which I just thought was hilarious and weird. Why?
Sometimes things like that come up, and I don't know, you probably run into this when you research for your show or whatever, research just on your own for fun. I don't know, what your weekends are like, but I
do.
I guess I just assume you're sitting there mining over
You assume
things.
correctly.
Then maybe you run into this as well. Sometimes something like that pops up, and I think to myself, why? And is there an answer somewhere that still exists, or is it like, Bill Round Number out there way back when was the one in charge of that for no reason and said, round numbers make me itchy or something, and then they just didn't do them. And is that lost to the sands of time, or is there a way? Because I'm always like, why? Why did that become a thing? Like, we can't say 1910. Exactly. What are we, crazy?
Right? The people at the time thought it was totally reasonable. No, we never use round numbers. We always go up or down.
Now, one of the things, as you mentioned, the designation that is a little chilling, that we don't totally have an analogy for today, is when you look at the thing and it says the discharge form and it says how many days have they been here, weeks have they been here, months have they been here, and then, of course, there's years that they've been here. There really aren't a lot of institutions. I mean, you look at it now in the modern way that the mental health system works from like lowest point of intervention, which is basically like take a class, bump up to like normal, say what would be considered when people say go to counseling, they think just go to your counselor once a week, twice a month, something like that. Like what I do at the outpatient level. And then you've got like the state hospital where people might go and they might be there for a year or more in an extreme case if there's no other place for them to go and they're a danger to themselves and others. There's a lot of criteria that would have to be for them to even be there 12 plus months, right? So that's very unusual now.
Yeah.
But then they're measuring it in, is it 9 or 11 years kind of numbers, right?
Exactly. Well, the interesting thing about that is, so when state hospitals and asylums were first created, so before the 1800s, there was nothing. There was no institution, zip, zilch, zero. You got put in a work home or you died on the street, basically. Or, if you were a part of a rich family, they would just put you away in a room somewhere. And that was it. That was mental health. But in the 1800s, there was some ideas about creating these like villages that came over from Europe. And so the first one was in New York. I can't remember if it was the first one, but it was definitely the biggest one, Pilgrim Asylum in New York. And the thing about these asylums is they were self-sustaining. Completely self-sustaining.
That was a prequel to that movie you watched, I think, also.
Exactly.
Pilgrim Asylum, right. It was the next one.
Yes,
it was made after,
right.
but it was a prequel. Yeah.
Exactly.
No, that's fascinating to think of like a pilgrim asylum. Never think about that.
Yeah.
I've never thought about that.
Yeah. So the people, they would stay in there for years. And when I say they were self-sustaining, I mean like they had their own fire stations, their own bakeries, their shoe shops, like places to create their own straitjackets, because there was no standard. Like people were just up there sewing up their own straitjackets.
It's a really hard-ass version of cut me a switch, I think, in a way. Go sew me a straitjacket.
Right, I'm gonna wrap you up in it if you don't pay attention. But yeah, it was just insane. And some of them they were so big, they had their own zip codes. So
wow, that's remarkable. I didn't know about these kind of like this community facet to this. That's amazing.
Neither did I, but it was because there was an idea going on about moral therapy. So there was something morally wrong with you. And so you needed to go out into nature. You needed to walk children in nature and like go out there and work with your hands, fish and garden and do things and read books. And
that was kind of part of their whole deal, right? Was everything sinful? I mean, Pilgrim, part of the whole puritanical approach.
Yeah.
And it's fascinating that in a way, with an attitude that we would think of as extremely regressive and shame-based, right? Of like a leper colony mentality, they're actually forming something that nowadays I would actually say is pretty progressive, is saying, let's get out inside and work with our hands and fish and make a community. And I mean, certainly not wall off a community for any of us with mental health issues. That would be fun.
Yeah.
But for I mean, just the labeling, alone would be very destructive. But to say get you involved in a community, it's so weirdly progressive and regressive at the same time.
Right. So, having people stay there for years and years and years at a time was not unusual.
And it was then sometime after that it transitioned into the lovely sort of institutionalization, which seemed like, and I don't know, you can cue me in if I'm just making up stuff off the top of my head here. You can at least pretend that it's historical based. That would really back me up here. I mean, don't undermine me here. But it seemed like that was the way culture went too. It was going from, here's this whole kind of natural world, and then here's this more institutionalized approach that we're going to really embrace, industrialize everything, white, shiny halls, scrub clean. And then it seemed like now we have kind of swung a little more away from that to say more human and more, whatever. But for a while, it seemed like that was the pursuit. The pursuit was to become more industrialized, institutionalized. This is a nice place where we can just tuck people away and you don't have to see them making their own moccasins and fire stations and zip
Yep.
codes and birds' nests. I don't know what people do, apparently.
Yeah.
But
you are. That is totally correct. So there was more in the 1800s. The 1800s were like a weird time with the Victorian era. People were freaky back in the day, and there was lots of stuff going on, and it was definitely a more, I don't know if holistic is the right word for it, and there wasn't a lot of people in the system. But then as the years went by, wars happened, poverty was growing, and you're totally correct, industrialization was happening, and there was just more poor people. Those poor people and the elderly were getting pushed away. You're totally right, just hidden away in these asylums. And instead of being curative, they were more custodial. So they didn't really focus on curing the people. They focused on, we're just going to hide them away from society because we've got this nice, shiny, industrial situation going on, and all of this badness is going to get shoved away here. Put it away.
Well, and it's like the embarrassing member of the family, right? Or the tuck them away at the asylum sort of a thing. And I mean, that's where you see that come up in old stories. Like, I'm just channeling, I think, like an Agatha Christie or a Rex Stout mystery where, here's there was another brother? What? And in the fiction of the time, it was always they were the ones that would break out and murder.
Yeah.
It's like,
yes.
Yeah, we were right to lock them away, sort of a thing, right? And very much, I love the way you put that as like the custodial, meaning that if you're the patient, you are not really, you're not custodian of yourself. There's no question of whether or not you're capable.
Yes.
Which then makes it very difficult to ever actually get out.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And there were some cases of people in there for basically their whole life, from their teenage years on until they shut down these asylums, not shut down completely, but downsized these asylums in the 1950s. Mm-hmm. So some people just lived their whole lives in there.
This statistical manual, this start to the idea of diagnosis that was being put out, was kind of in some ways involved in a transition between these two times you're talking about, right? The whole colony community thing and the whole deep institutionalization. There's a famous study called On Being Sane in Insane Places. It's not what we're talking about today exactly, but it was in the 70s where a bunch of psychology students basically admitted themselves to the psychiatric units and then tried to get out with a knowledge of what was and was not symptomatic. So they would self-admit, and then they would report after being admitted. They would go through their evaluation period and report things that didn't meet the criteria for diagnoses, and see how many of them were told, you really shouldn't be here. And found that it was actually a little harder to convince people that they were healthy once they were in, even if they'd never presented symptoms. So there's still, I mean, that's as early as the 70s, which is longer ago than, some of us who were born at the end of the 70s like to think. But anyway, that's a while ago, but it's not that while ago. It's not like Pilgrim Asylum long ago.
No.
So, which is the new expression I'm going to use. But you look, and that has been woven throughout. And so this is an interesting bridge period here, this maybe 1918 period where they're starting to try to be scientific about it in a way. When we look back now, and we don't always look at their science back then as like, wow, cool science.
Yeah. I feel like a lot of times people look back on the science of the past with air quotes. They were doing science. Look at them. They're cute science.
I'm trying. Two thoughts I have, and maybe I can ask you the one while pretending not to Google the other. So the one thought about that, just in a general sense, when people are that way, and we get very, retroactively judgmental of the science of the time. Many people view that as kind of a judgmental, looking back and saying like, oh, they're not as smart as us or whatever. As a historian, how do you respond to that kind of thinking?
I respond and say, like, how dare you, you total jerk? Because I mean, it's super rude. How dare they say things like that? Because we count on so much of the science of the past. Yeah, some of it was janky, of course.
Right.
Like, duh. Some of the science now is janky. That's just the nature of science. Anybody can do it. But, if we look back, all of the things like radium was created long time ago. All of the electricity.
We were just telling my son about this the other day. We were talking about the Radium Girls incidents of painting, on watch faces and highlighting makeup and getting tumors and yeah, exactly. Yeah, when we look at that, it's like, that was crazy. Well, how could you do that? And it's like, because it was a new glowy thing that we thought was cool. I mean, nobody knew what it was. Yeah.
They just didn't know. It's not that they were dumb. It's just that they didn't know. It's the same thing with smoking. People didn't know. People would prescribe doctors would prescribe cigarettes to women. Like, it'll take the edge off. Yeah, duh. It'll take the edge off when you're pregnant. It'll also harm your baby. But they didn't know. There wasn't enough information yet.
Yeah, I grew up in Pennsylvania, about a half hour away from Hershey. And so we'd always go, and we had a couple of these like reproduction historic little tins that chocolate used to come in, and they had the old ads printed on them, and there were doctors saying like, oh yeah, chocolate, it's good for you, it's going to do this, it's going to do that, and it's a miracle drug. So it is interesting, and I think that just as you and I, as we were setting up for this episode, I was commenting on your episode of your podcast recently about the fork.
Yeah,
and it seems like something that you would hope would provoke humility, right? That would make us feel like, oh wow, you look back and they used to think the fork was this terrible contraption. It was stupid. It was of the devil. And we laugh at that now, instead of looking at ourselves and saying, I wonder what my kids' will say. Can you believe those Neanderthals?
Yeah.
Thought that back then, kind of a thing. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I think people get a little uppity and like in themselves when they think about the people in the past, just because I mean, we have all of human knowledge at our fingertips all the time in a phone, but do we use it all the time? No.
So the thing that I was going to pretend that I knew off the top of my head that I didn't Google, and I'm definitely not looking at a Wikipedia page on the side of the screen right now. I wanted to know the date that Phineas Gage happened. And I shouldn't say Phineas Gage happened. He had a whole life, but this one event in his life. So it was 1848, with quite a few years. Well, that would be what, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90, like 60 years before this manual came out, was when Phineas Gage accidentally had a railroad tie blown through his brain. Famous case that they always talk about this in intro psych courses and things. And that was where they made a discovery that part of the brain being injured was not the same thing as the whole brain being injured. That the frontal cortex being damaged did not kill him. Everybody saw it happen and just was sure he was dead. Yeah. But then his behavior changed, where he was more irritable. He was always an even-keeled guy before, I guess, and he lost his job. He couldn't hold relationships. It was very hard for him to have self-control, and he'd get very emotional. His emotional regulation skills were gone. He lived for about 12 years after, apparently. I just pulled that up as well.
So knowledgeable.
And it's really nice because when you Google nowadays, it also says, hey, didn't you mean to ask these 5 other questions that you can click and get a quick answer to? Yeah, I did.
Yes, I did, Google. Thank you.
And if I think, this is my memory, I think that his death actually didn't have anything to do with the injury to the brain as much as it did like just infection and, poor care of things at the time, I think. But
yeah.
So you can.
I'm not quite sure.
That,
I'm not familiar with how he died. I do know about the railroad tie in the head, but that's so interesting.
So this was a good 60 years building off of that, and yet I notice when I look at this, there's not a lot said about the physical locations of the brain or anything about that, that they would have known. Yeah. Even the concept of like, this is something that goes back to some kind of they have an idea if you get bonked in the head. It doesn't say bonked. I don't mean to make it sound dumb, but it's not like
no. You just got a
head
little
go
bonked.
boom, But, if you have a trauma, they got that trauma to the brain could impact behavior. But, it was very interesting to see how they really, for a long time, didn't have the capacity to study the organ of the brain in a way that we do now.
And for a long time, it was illegal to open up the brain or the human body at all.
Yeah. Yeah, that was Benjamin Franklin sort of helped people do those kind of secret autopsy experiments, didn't he? Is that a thing?
He did. He was like a secret grave digger from time to time.
Yeah.
Moonlighted as a grave digger, founding father and grave digger.
Yeah. I had heard that they found a bunch of skeletons in his basement and in his house in England when he was an ambassador. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, that's right. Yeah. He was an interesting man.
I'm looking forward to the episode of your podcast where you're going to talk about him.
Yes, I do. I want to talk all about the founding fathers.
Planting seeds here. I think they want to hear a lot of things that are kind of written in here. It reminds me of that pilgrim mentality where it's like regressive and progressive at the same time in some ways, because they're really trying to classify things in the healthcare category, but they almost can't help but do it in a way that's very shaming.
Yes. And I think that we perceive it as shaming because we don't use a lot of the vocabulary that they use now. It's now rude and not correct to use some of this vocabulary.
When we look at number 19 and number 20 here on the, I know you got it memorized. Of the different diagnostic types here, they talk about psychosis with constitutional psychopathic inferiority. And that would be where you'd fit if you had, like, nowadays what you'd call generalized anxiety disorder, depressive disorder, major depressive disorder, bipolar disorder, those kinds of things. You'd be psychopathically inferior. And then, then the next one is psychosis with mental deficiency, which it says is where you should put people with intellectual deficiency or feeble-mindedness, which was a medical term at the time.
Yeah.
And so, and it reminds me of terms that we don't really use anymore. When I was young, mentally retarded, was being used as and so I'm not that old, but it was also a medical term, right? It was considered a medical term. As well as it wasn't that long before that moron was a medical term, right?
Yeah.
For
moron, imbecile, idiot, feeble-minded, what are some other ones? Mentally handicapped, lunatic. Lunatic was a medical term.
Was that when they believed that the moon was involved in because of lunar? Is that true? Did that come from that?
I don't know. I did not research that etymology of that word.
Didn't anticipate that was going to come up. And the magic of editing will
right.
No, but
you told them I knew everything.
You know what? I suddenly remembered. Click. That it turns out it is. Yeah, lunatic originally meant someone who went crazy with a phase of the moon and was associated with the idea of werewolf type of insanity or the werewolf legend.
Oh yes,
werewolves, another term that used to be medical. We're going way back now, probably.
Way back in the day. Werewolf, vampire, banshee, all fully medical terms.
So, I mean, it is interesting to see that. And I guess it kind of goes into that historical context question, though, too, doesn't it? Because at the time, was this shaming? I mean, I don't know, because I'm looking at it as like a yes and a no, right? Because it's like, no, but then it was used that way. Because what do we know to start calling other kids these names?
Right. So, of course, language is a living thing, and it's the meaning of it is determined by the users. So back during this time, I think it wasn't, this is from my very professional opinion, that at this time, it was not seen as a shameful thing. It wasn't your fault that you had some sort of moral deficiency, especially in the mid to late 1800s when the moral therapy was going on. They used insane person, they used lunatic, all of these words, but at this time, it wasn't a shameful thing. You had a moral deficiency and you were there to get better. It was all about healing. But then gradually, as society's morals were changing, as the things that we found important were changing, these words did turn into, excuse my cat, I'm so sorry.
Do you just have one? I saw it.
I have
it
two.
Made it, okay, I was going to say it made it all the way across the room and possibly changed color, but I wasn't sure if I trusted my memory.
Magical cats.
I don't know what they do in Japan. I'm an American. I think everything is magical outside of here. No.
We do. We have magical cats. But what was I saying?
It wasn't your fault for being broken.
It was, yes. It's my cat's fault for being broken now. But yeah, it wasn't your fault. It was the morals, and you were there to be better. And like I said earlier, that there was a difference between curative and custodial. So I think at that point where care turned from curative to custodial is when it did start turning to a more condescending set of vocabulary.
And do you think that the dynamic, no, I think it's totally true the way you're saying that, but do you think that that dynamic lent itself to that transition as far as, because you look at a category of, well, it's not your fault that you're morally deficient. You're still morally deficient. It's not your fault that you're less than and we have to put you over in this colony, but we still have to. Which you could say it was certainly not just confined to mental health care. That was a lot of things. If, going back to being poor was considered to be morally deficient, as you put it, like,
exactly.
You're in that class of people. You just are, God put you there, or a circumstance, it doesn't matter. You're there. And the rest of us have to take care of you. It was something I noticed very interesting during the run of Downton Abbey, actually, which I thought was very fascinating, was that they did represent that. The interesting thing to me was how much, as modern people, to say we were kind of on their side. I remember there was one episode where one of the maids spoke up against one of the wealthy neighbors, Daisy. I won't pretend I don't remember her name. Anyway, it was Daisy, and she speaks up to these landowners and is like, "Who do you think you are?"
Yeah.
The Downton Abbeyans, are like, "Oh, I can't believe
the upstairs people."
And I found that I heard comments by people and whatever and online, and it was like, "Oh wow, what are you doing?" And it's like, yeah, it was dangerous, but was there part of us that was like, hey, good for her, tell them off? It's like, that seems a more modern sensibility. But when you get immersed in that world, even in a fictional basis, it's easy for us to step into and say, hey, don't rock the boat, Daisy. What are you doing? This is,
right.
There's that feeling where you get into that vein of thinking. So at the same time, I'm not attacking the people in the past, but I do think that did segue itself into that thinking.
I completely agree with you. And I am a firm believer in that you don't know how you would react in a situation until you are in that situation. And even then, you don't know how you would react because you don't know how the other people react. You don't know what kind of state of mind you would be in, what kind of situation, financially, economically, spiritually, mentally, what have you. There's so many things, so many factors in life that determine how you would react. And so I agree with you. I think it's really easy for us to like kind of sink in and be like, oh no, don't do that. That's dangerous. You're a downstairs person. Know your place. So
right. And maybe we just dig her and don't want her to get whatever they do to her then off with her head. I think it was the rule.
Yeah, I'm definitely of that time.
Most of my understanding of ancient law comes from Alice in Wonderland.
A great place to start,
right.
Honestly.
That's what I thought.
Really don't need much of anything else.
Painting roses different color, I think, was a big part of life back then, if I remember my history correctly.
Tea and half birthdays,
I'm forming this feeling as we're talking that we'd hope that people would look back at us and say, hey, they were trying to help people out. And we can see that there to where at the time that they were coming up with these things and trying to basically categorize people and basically study people and trying to figure out what was going on with people, really without all the tools that they needed. I'm not sure what point I'm trying to make. I'm probably going to trail that part off. But what are your thoughts?
I understand what you're trying to say. I think I agree with you. I hope that people look back on us in kindness and understanding. for me personally, as a history person, I try to look back as unbiasedly as I can and look back with kindness and just assume the best in oh my goodness, my cats, I'm so sorry.
Well, it sounded like they just died.
They just collided with one another in the little tube that they have to play in.
Oh no. It's like that little McDonald's playground.
Yeah, exactly that. I'm so sorry. Your editing job is probably going to just be.
Oh no, I'm keeping that. That's staying in. That's for cat owners are 90% of our audience.
They're the best kind of people. The best. But anyways, yeah, I try to look back in kindness and just assume that people are trying to do the best with what they have, because I mean, if you look at these giant state asylums, they spent years and thousands of dollars creating these institutions when they could have just left the people die on the street. Like, it's have to.
One of the things that historically is very challenging when we want to look at that is that when they deinstitutionalized, they were moving away from a lot of things that were really quite bad for people, obviously, that had gotten out of hand, I guess. But at the same time, we as a society, we as a mental health industry, whatever, never really replaced that. Not really. That's why we don't have the analogy for that now. You still see it depicted in movies where they'll say, oh, let me go find that person who's away at the asylum. And it's always a big, huge house and these nice grounds and people doing watercolors. And it's like, that doesn't exist. That's not really what a lot of them were probably like then either. Maybe somewhere in between Pilgrim Village and the One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, there might have been a place or two like that, but that just only exists in movies. And so we almost assume that there's this place where people go, but it's like, no, actually it's prison. It's the street. It's, so we haven't really gotten so progressive with our psychological health care. So you could argue that, boy, so many of them back then would be appalled to see you just turn people out in the street. What are you, nuts? They use a lot of terms like, are you crazy and are you nuts, apparently, from what I'm doing.
But that goes back again to, when people look back at the past, they have this holier than thou mentality when they look back. And have we cured the homeless problem as the human race? No, we have not. So calm down, people, calm down.
Well, so tell everybody your podcast. Where do they find you? What do they do? How do they listen and give you all kinds of listenership and accolades?
Well, if you would like to hear my cats run around in the background as I record a podcast by myself.
Magic Cats. That's the new broadcast.
Magic Cats. So I do a weekly fun history podcast. So I talk about everything from, the forks. I talk about the sordid history of the fork. My first episode was about the Mayan turkey god of 200 BC. The podcast that I'm putting out tomorrow actually is about the secret art of Pompeii bathhouses. And spoiler alert, there's a lot of penises.
Wow.
All of them there.
Yeah.
So, I don't know if you have to bleep that out.
One of the things that, no, we can allow the word penises.
Thank you.
One of the things that I think is really fascinating about the way that you do that, and I feel like a lot of people are doing this to varying levels of interesting, and you're doing it in a way that is interesting and very fun and funny, I will add too, because I really find it entertaining to listen to you talk about these things, the way that you frame it. But it's kind of, to me, like almost that a micro-journalist approach to history in a way. Like you're picking a thing, you're saying, we're going to do this thing, and we're going to talk all about it. And there's a whole lot, aside from just the enjoyment and some of the funness of that kind of history, there's a lot that you talk about in your fork episode, is the history of the interaction with society and culture and the church. And I'll go ahead. This is just also to prove that I've listened to more than just the Fork episode. When you talked about the history of drag, super interesting to see how much the drag culture has had influence over pop culture and the way that we talk and the way that we do entertainment. Now it's just things that I, as someone who was not part of that culture, was not aware of, and now I'm more aware of. So very interesting, very funny, and also useful.
Thank you. Thank you so much. That's what I'm trying to bring light to things that affect our everyday life that, we don't really know the history of. And it's really cool and interesting. So,
what's the name of your show again?
The name of my show is For the Love of History with TK, a little subtitle. So For the Love of History. And you can find me on Apple Podcasts. I'm on Spotify. I'm on Captivate. I've got an Instagram as well. So you can follow me at For the Love of _history. I put out live feeds for the things I'm working on. And I also do a daily quiz that is along the lines of the theme of the week's podcast.
And do people get back with red ink marks, since you are a junior high teacher, historically anyway? Yeah.
Yes. Now I am a high school teacher, so they get a lot of red marks.
All right. Well, hey, thank you again for doing this. Really, lots of fun to talk about.
It was fantastic.
Thank you for listening to the Court and Parts Podcast Network. To listen to more Court and Parts shows, visit courtandarts.com.